On a cold autumn afternoon in New York City, the bustling streets of Central Park were filled with the usual mix of tourists, joggers, and families enjoying the crisp air. Amidst the vibrant life of the city, a young woman sat alone on a bench, her face buried in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was oblivious to the world around her, lost in the depths of her despair. Margaret Hastings, a reclusive billionaire known for her philanthropic work, was out for a rare walk through the park. She was a woman of grace and poise, often seen attending high-profile charity events, yet she lived a life of solitude, her past cloaked in mystery. As she strolled through the park, something caught her eye, a young woman crying alone. Margaret paused, her heart tugging in a way she hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, Margaret approached the girl, her expensive heels clicking softly against the pavement. "Excuse me, dear," she began gently, her voice filled with concern. "Are you all right? Can I help you with something?" The girl looked up, startled by the sudden attention. Her eyes were red and puffy, her hair a mess. She quickly wiped her face, embarrassed to be seen in such a state. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's nothing," she mumbled, trying to compose herself. But Margaret wasn't one to be easily deterred. There was something about this girl, something that felt familiar. "It's okay," Margaret reassured her, taking a seat beside her on the bench. "Sometimes, talking to someone can help. My name is Margaret. What's yours?" The girl hesitated, her eyes scanning Margaret's elegant attire before finally answering. "I'm Emily," she whispered. "Emily Collins." Margaret smiled warmly, trying to put the girl at ease. "Nice to meet you, Emily. Would you like to talk about what's bothering you? I'm a good listener." Emily bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the ground. For a moment, she said nothing, weighing whether to trust this stranger. But there was something kind in Margaret's eyes, something that made her feel safe. It's been a hard day," Emily finally confessed, her voice trembling. "I've been struggling for a while now. Life hasn't been kind to me." Margaret nodded, sensing the depth of the young woman's pain. "I understand," she said softly. "Life can be incredibly unfair sometimes. But you're not alone, Emily. You don't have to go through this by yourself." Emily looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes for the first time. There was a sincerity there, a genuine concern that Emily hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. I feel so lost. I was adopted when I was a baby, and I never knew my real parents. I've always felt like something was missing, and lately, that emptiness has been unbearable." Margaret's heart skipped a beat at Emily's words. Adopted? A wave of unease washed over her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "That must be incredibly difficult," Margaret said, carefully choosing her words. "But you're here now, and that's what matters. You're strong, Emily. I can see that." Emily nodded, though her eyes were still filled with sorrow. "I just don't know what to do anymore," she admitted. "I feel like I don't belong anywhere." Margaret's chest tightened as she listened. There was something eerily familiar about Emily's story, something that stirred memories Margaret had long buried. "Emily," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "have you ever tried to find your birth parents?" Emily shook her head. "No," she replied. "I wouldn't even know where to start. And besides, I'm not sure they'd want to find me." Margaret reached out, gently placing a hand on Emily's. "You deserve to know where you come from," she said softly, "and I'm sure they would want to know you. If you ever decide to look for them, I'd be more than happy to help." Emily's eyes welled up with tears once more, but this time, there was a glimmer of hope in them. "Thank you, Margaret," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That means more to me than you know." Margaret smiled, though her mind was racing. As they sat together on that park bench, an inexplicable feeling gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. Who was this girl, really? And why did she feel such a powerful connection to her? As they continued to talk, neither of them realized that this chance encounter was about to change their lives forever. The days following their encounter in Central Park were a whirlwind for Margaret. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly significant about Emily. It was more than just sympathy for a young woman in distress. It was a deep, inexplicable pull, as if fate had intertwined their paths for a reason. Margaret found herself thinking about Emily constantly. She was haunted by the girl's story, by the pain in her eyes, and by the strange sense of familiarity that lingered every time she replayed their conversation in her mind. She had spent years building walls around her heart, keeping the world at arm's length, but those walls were beginning to crumble. One evening, after another restless day, Margaret decided she needed to learn more about Emily. She called up her trusted assistant, Rachel, and asked her to dig into Emily Collins' background. It was a request that felt both intrusive and necessary. Margaret justified it to herself as a precaution, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. Rachel was efficient and discreet, and within a few hours, she had gathered all the available information. "I found some records on Emily Collins," Rachel reported over the phone. "She was adopted by a couple from upstate New York when she was a baby. The adoption was handled through a small agency that no longer exists. Her adoptive parents passed away in a car accident a few years ago, leaving her with nothing but a few personal belongings and a small inheritance." Margaret's heart ached as she listened. Emily's life had been marked by loss and loneliness, more than most people could endure. But there was something else, something that made Margaret's pulse quicken. "Rachel, did you find anything about her birth parents?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Rachel hesitated before responding. "That's the strange part, Ms. Hastings. There's no information about them. It's as if they never existed. The adoption records don't even list names, just that she was found abandoned at the doorstep of a church. There's no birth certificate, no hospital records, nothing. It's like she appeared out of nowhere." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Out of nowhere," she murmured, her mind racing. There was something unsettling about it all, something that didn't add up. But before she could delve further into her thoughts, Rachel interrupted. "Is everything all right, Ms. Hastings?" Rachel asked, sensing the tension in Margaret's silence. "Yes, Rachel. Thank you for the information," Margaret replied, though her voice betrayed her unease. "That will be all for now." As she hung up, Margaret couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. Emily's story was beginning to mirror the nightmare that had haunted Margaret for 2 decades, the disappearance of her own daughter. It was a loss that had nearly destroyed her, a wound that had never healed. The memory was as sharp as ever. 20 years ago, Margaret's life had been turned upside down when her baby girl was taken from her. There had been no ransom note, no leads, just a devastating emptiness that consumed Margaret's world. She had spent years searching, hiring the best detectives, offering rewards, and praying for her daughter's return. But all efforts had led to dead ends, and Margaret was forced to accept that she might never see her child again. Now, as Margaret stood in her opulent Manhattan penthouse, overlooking the city that had given her everything but the one thing she truly wanted, she felt a familiar pain return. Could it be possible? Could Emily be the daughter she had lost all those years ago? The idea seemed too wild, too improbable. Yet the more Margaret thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The timing, the lack of information about Emily's past, the unexplainable connection she felt. It all pointed to something more than just coincidence. But how could she be sure? She couldn't simply ask Emily if she was the child she had lost. And even if she could, there was no guarantee that Emily would believe her, or that she would want to have anything to do with her. Margaret knew she needed proof, something tangible to confirm her suspicions. A DNA test would provide the answer she sought, but convincing Emily to take one without raising suspicion would be difficult. Yet, as Margaret stared at the old photograph of her baby girl on the mantel, she felt a determination rise within her. This wasn't just about satisfying her curiosity. It was about finding the truth, about finally putting to rest the agonizing questions that had plagued her for so long. If there was even the slightest chance that Emily was her daughter, Margaret had to know. The following morning, Margaret made a decision. She would invite Emily to her home under the pretense of wanting to help her get back on her feet. They had bonded in the park, and Margaret knew that Emily would likely accept her offer. It was the perfect opportunity to get closer to her, to learn more about her, and to find the right moment to suggest the test. Margaret's heart raced as she dialed Emily's number. When the young woman answered, her voice was soft, almost fragile. "Hello, Emily, it's Margaret," she said, trying to sound as casual as possible. "I've been thinking about our conversation in the park, and I wanted to offer you some help. Why don't you come over to my place tomorrow? We can talk more and see how I can assist you." There was a brief silence on the other end, and Margaret held her breath, waiting for Emily's response. "That's very kind of you, Margaret," Emily finally replied, her voice filled with gratitude. "I'd love to come over. Thank you so much." As Margaret hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Tomorrow could change everything. It could bring her the closure she had longed for, or it could shatter the fragile hope she had begun to nurture. Either way, there was no turning back now. The next day, Margaret found herself pacing nervously through the grand halls of her penthouse. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow on the elegant furnishings, but Margaret barely noticed. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding with anticipation. Today, she would face the possibility that had consumed her thoughts since she first met Emily. Could this young woman truly be her long-lost daughter? Margaret had always been a woman of control, accustomed to handling even the most difficult situations with grace and poise. But now, as she waited for Emily to arrive, she felt uncharacteristically vulnerable. What if she was wrong? What if Emily wasn't her daughter, and all she had was a fleeting sense of connection? Or worse, what if she was right, and Emily rejected her? The doorbell rang, jolting Margaret from her thoughts. She took a deep breath, smoothing her dress as she walked to the door. When she opened it, there stood Emily, looking both nervous and hopeful. She was dressed modestly, her hair neatly pulled back, but there was an undeniable beauty in her simplicity. "Emily, it's so good to see you." Margaret greeted her with a warm smile, though she could feel the tension simmering beneath her composed exterior. "Thank you for inviting me, Margaret," Emily replied, her voice tinged with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took in the luxurious surroundings. "This place is incredible." Margaret chuckled softly, trying to ease the tension. "It's just home," she said, though she knew it was much more than that to most people. "Come, let's sit and talk." She led Emily to the spacious living room, where they settled into plush armchairs facing each other. Margaret offered Emily some tea, which she accepted gratefully, and for a few moments, they sat in silence, sipping their drinks. Margaret could sense Emily's nervousness, and she knew she had to tread carefully. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," Margaret began, her voice calm and measured. "When we met in the park, I couldn't help but feel a connection to you. It was unusual, to say the least." Emily looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "A connection? What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Emily, I lost my daughter 20 years ago. She was taken from me when she was just a baby, and I never found her. Your story, your background, it reminded me of her. I know it sounds strange, but I can't shake the feeling that there might be a connection between us." Emily's eyes widened in shock, and she set her teacup down with trembling hands. "Are you saying you think I might be your daughter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know for sure," Margaret admitted, her voice softening. "But I need to find out. I've been searching for her for so long. And when I met you, something inside me just clicked. It might be nothing, but I can't ignore the possibility." Emily was silent, her mind racing as she tried to process what Margaret was saying. Could it be true? Could she really be the daughter of a wealthy, powerful woman like Margaret Hastings? The idea seemed too incredible to be real, but at the same time, something deep within her resonated with Margaret's words. I don't know what to say," Emily stammered, her emotions swirling in a chaotic mix of hope and fear. "How would we even know if it's true?" Margaret leaned forward, her expression gentle but determined. "There's a way to find out," she said carefully. "We could do a DNA test. It's the only way to be sure." Emily's breath caught in her throat. A DNA test? The thought of it terrified her. What if the results showed that she wasn't Margaret's daughter? Or worse, what if they showed that she was? How would that change her life? Could she handle the truth, whatever it might be? But as she looked into Margaret's eyes, she saw the same fear mirrored back at her. along with a deep, aching need for answers. In that moment, Emily realized that Margaret wasn't just some wealthy stranger trying to meddle in her life. She was a mother, desperate for closure, for the truth that had eluded her for so many years. "Okay," Emily said finally, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "I'll do the test. I want to know the truth too." Margaret exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Emily," she said, reaching out to gently squeeze the younger woman's hand. "No matter what the results show, I want you to know that I'm here for you. You're not alone in this." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "When will we do it?" "I've already arranged for a discreet lab to handle the testing," Margaret explained. "We can go as soon as you're ready." The decision made, Margaret called for her driver, and within minutes, they were on their way to the lab. The ride was quiet, both women lost in their thoughts, each grappling with the magnitude of what they were about to do. For Margaret, it was a chance to finally heal the wound that had been festering for 2 decades. For Emily, it was a chance to discover a truth she had never even known to search for. At the lab, the process was quick and straightforward. A simple swab of the cheek, a few signatures, and it was done. But the simplicity of the procedure did nothing to alleviate the tension between them. As they left the lab, Margaret turned to Emily. "We should have the results in a few days," she said, trying to sound reassuring. "Until then, why don't you stay at my place? It'll give us a chance to get to know each other better, no matter what the outcome is." Emily hesitated, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. But there was a kindness in Margaret's eyes, a sincerity that made her feel safe. And though she barely understood why, Emily found herself nodding. "All right," she agreed. "I'll stay." Margaret smiled, a flicker of hope lighting up her heart. As they drove back to the penthouse, she couldn't help but feel that she was on the brink of something monumental, something that could either bring her the peace she had longed for or shatter her world all over again. For now, all they could do was wait. The following days at Margaret's penthouse were a mix of tentative bonding and underlying tension. Emily had never experienced anything like this, staying in a home that could easily fit the entirety of the modest apartment she had shared with her adoptive parents. The luxury surrounding her was overwhelming, but it was the emotional weight of the situation that truly occupied her mind. Margaret, too, found herself walking a delicate line. She wanted to get to know Emily, to bridge the years they might have lost. But she was also keenly aware that the results of the DNA test could bring everything crashing down. As much as she tried to remain optimistic, the fear of disappointment loomed large. Their interactions were careful at first, like two people navigating unfamiliar territory. But as the hours turned into days, a natural rhythm began to develop between them. Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying Emily's company. The young woman had a quiet strength, a resilience that reminded Margaret of herself at that age. Emily, for her part, was surprised by how at ease she felt with Margaret, despite the circumstances. There was a warmth to her that belied the cold, hard exterior that wealth often projected. One afternoon, as they sat together in the sunlit conservatory, Margaret decided to share a bit of her past. "This place," she began, looking around at the lush greenery surrounding them. "It wasn't always like this. When I first moved in, it was empty, just walls and windows. I had lost all interest in decorating or even living, really, after my daughter was taken." Emily listened intently, sensing the depth of pain behind Margaret's words. "What was she like?" "Your daughter, I mean," Emily asked softly, not wanting to intrude but needing to know more. Margaret smiled wistfully, her eyes misting over as she remembered. She was beautiful, a tiny thing, with the brightest eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest room. I used to call her my little sunshine. Losing her, it felt like the sun had gone out of my life. Emily's heart ached for Margaret, the sorrow in her voice palpable. "I can't even imagine what that must have been like for you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "To lose a child, it's unimaginable." Margaret nodded, wiping away a tear. "It was. I spent years trying to find her, clinging to every shred of hope, no matter how small. But eventually, I had to accept that she was gone. The hardest part was not knowing what happened to her, if she was safe, if she was loved. That uncertainty, it never goes away. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Margaret's confession hanging in the air. Emily could feel the depth of Margaret's loss, and it struck a chord within her. For so long, she had felt like something was missing in her life, an emptiness she couldn't explain. But now, sitting here with Margaret, she wondered if perhaps that emptiness had a name. "Margaret," Emily began hesitantly, "if the test comes back and we're not, related, would you still want to know me? Would you still want to be a part of my life?" Margaret looked at Emily, her heart swelling with affection. "Of course, Emily," she said without hesitation. "You're an incredible young woman, and I'd be honored to be a part of your life, no matter what the results say." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had always been cautious about letting people in, about trusting too easily, but with Margaret, it felt different. There was a sincerity in her words, a genuine care that Emily had rarely encountered. As the days passed, they fell into an easy routine. Margaret showed Emily around the city, taking her to her favorite spots, places she hadn't visited in years. They explored art galleries, strolled through Central Park, and even attended a charity gala where Margaret introduced Emily to some of her closest friends. Emily marveled at how effortlessly Margaret moved through the world of the elite, but she also noticed the genuine kindness she displayed to everyone she met. There was no pretense, no arrogance. Just a woman who had been through unimaginable pain and had come out the other side stronger. One evening, after returning from a day out, they found themselves in the penthouse kitchen. Margaret had insisted on cooking dinner, wanting to share a meal made with her own hands. As they worked together, chopping vegetables and stirring pots, the atmosphere was relaxed, almost domestic. "Do you cook often?" Emily asked as she watched Margaret expertly handle a chef's knife. Margaret chuckled. "Not as much as I'd like. I used to cook all the time before everything. But it feels good to do it again, especially with company." Emily smiled, feeling a sense of normalcy she hadn't experienced in a long time. "My adoptive mom taught me how to cook," she said, a hint of nostalgia in her voice. "We didn't have much, but she could make the simplest ingredients taste like a feast." Margaret's heart softened at the mention of Emily's adoptive parents. "They must have been wonderful people," she said gently. "They were," Emily agreed, her voice tinged with sadness. "I miss them every day, but I'm grateful for the time I had with them. They gave me so much love, even when they had so little." Margaret reached over and squeezed Emily's hand. "It sounds like they were exactly the parents you needed." As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily, the barriers between them slowly dissolving. They laughed, shared stories, and for a moment, it felt like they were simply two women enjoying each other's company, rather than a potential mother and daughter awaiting life-changing news. But as the evening wore on, the reality of their situation crept back in. The DNA results were due any day now, and the uncertainty hung over them like a dark cloud. Despite their growing bond, both women knew that the results could change everything, either solidifying their connection or forcing them to confront the possibility that their paths had crossed by chance and nothing more. That night, as Emily lay in the guest room, she found herself unable to sleep. She stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing with what-ifs and maybes. She had never truly believed in fate, but now, with everything that had happened, she couldn't help but wonder if there was a greater force at play, bringing her and Margaret together. In the master bedroom, Margaret was equally restless. She had tried to prepare herself for whatever the results might reveal, but the truth was, she had already allowed herself to hope. Hope that Emily was her daughter, that after all these years of searching and suffering, she might finally have the chance to hold her child again. As dawn broke over the city, both women knew that the moment of truth was fast approaching, and with it, the potential for a new beginning, or the end of a fragile dream that had only just begun to take shape. In the silence of the night, with nothing but their thoughts for company, they were closer than ever to the answers they sought. But whether those answers would bring them together or tear them apart remained to be seen. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Margaret's penthouse, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. It was the day they had been anxiously awaiting, yet dreading. The day the DNA test results would arrive. The air was thick with tension, every ticking second feeling like a small eternity. Margaret had woken early, unable to sleep for more than a few hours. She dressed meticulously, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the clasp of her necklace. It was the same necklace she had worn the day her daughter was born, a small token of hope that she had carried with her through the years. Today, it felt heavier around her neck, as if the weight of all her hopes and fears were pulling her down. In the guest room, Emily was just as restless. She had spent most of the night tossing and turning, her mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. She had never allowed herself to hope for something like this, and now that it was within reach, she wasn't sure how to handle it. Part of her was terrified that the results would confirm a connection she wasn't prepared for, while another part feared they would reveal that everything she had started to believe was just an illusion. By mid-morning, the anticipation was almost unbearable. Margaret had prepared breakfast, but neither of them had much of an appetite. They sat across from each other at the dining table, the silence between them charged with unspoken thoughts. The usual easy conversation had evaporated, replaced by a palpable tension that neither could escape. As they sipped their coffee, Margaret's phone buzzed on the table. Both women froze, their eyes locked on the device. It was a notification from the lab. The results were ready. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she reached for the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before looking at Emily. "The results are in," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, her throat tight with anxiety. Should we open it together?" she asked, her voice shaking. Margaret hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, let's do it together." With trembling hands, Margaret unlocked her phone and opened the email from the lab. The words on the screen blurred before her eyes as she scrolled down to the results section. Emily leaned in, her breath catching in her throat as she waited for the moment that could change everything. Margaret's eyes scanned the page, and for a brief, agonizing moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, she saw it. The confirmation she had both longed for and feared. The DNA results showed a 99.9% match. Emily was her daughter. Margaret's breath hitched, her vision swimming as a wave of emotion crashed over her. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Emily, you're my daughter." Emily stared at the screen, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She had spent her entire life feeling like an outsider, like a piece of her was missing. And now, in a matter of seconds, everything had changed. The woman sitting across from her, the woman who had shown her such kindness and compassion, was her mother. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as the reality of it all began to sink in. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I can't believe this is real." Margaret reached across the table, taking Emily's hands in her own. "It's real, Emily," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're my daughter. After all these years, I've finally found you." The tears that Emily had been holding back finally spilled over, and she let out a shaky breath as the weight of the moment overwhelmed her. "I never thought I'd find my real family," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I always felt like something was missing, but I didn't know what it was until now." Margaret stood up, moving around the table to pull Emily into her arms. "You were never lost, my love," she whispered, holding her daughter close. "We were always connected, even when we didn't know it. And now that I've found you, I'm never letting you go." Emily clung to Margaret, her tears soaking into her mother's blouse. The years of pain, of wondering who she was and where she came from, seemed to melt away in Margaret's embrace. For the first time in her life, she felt whole, like she had finally found the piece of herself that had been missing for so long. They stood there for what felt like hours, wrapped in each other's arms, as the reality of their reunion sank in. Margaret stroked Emily's hair, whispering soothing words, while Emily sobbed quietly, releasing years of pent-up emotion. It was a moment of healing, of reconciliation, and of profound love. When they finally pulled apart, both women were smiling through their tears. There was a lightness in the air that hadn't been there before, a sense of relief and joy that filled the room. "I have so many questions," Emily said, her voice still shaky. "About you, about our family. There's so much I want to know. And I want to tell you everything," Margaret replied, wiping a tear from Emily's cheek. "But we have all the time in the world now. There's no rush. We can take this journey together, one step at a time." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. For the first time, the future didn't seem so frightening. She had her mother by her side, and together, they could face whatever came next. They spent the rest of the day talking, sharing stories, and getting to know each other in a way they had never had the chance to before. Margaret told Emily about her childhood, about the life she had built, and about the emptiness she had carried with her since losing her daughter. Emily shared her own stories, the struggles and triumphs of her life, and the sense of longing that had always been with her. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city, they moved to the balcony, looking out over the skyline. The world seemed full of possibilities now, full of hope and new beginnings. Margaret turned to Emily, her heart overflowing with love. "I want you to know that no matter what happens, you'll always have a home here," she said softly. "You're part of this family, and nothing will ever change that." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that she had never felt before. "Thank you, Mom," she replied, the words slipping out naturally, as if she had been saying it all her life. "I feel like I'm finally where I'm meant to be." They stood there together, mother and daughter, as the lights of the city twinkled below them. The journey that had brought them here had been long and painful, but it had led them to this moment, a moment of reunion, of love, and of the promise of a future they would build together. In the days to come, there would be challenges to face and more questions to answer. But for now, they were content to simply be together, to bask in the joy of finally finding each other. And in that moment, as they held each other close, they knew that they had found something far more precious than anything money could buy. They had found each other. The days following their reunion were filled with a mix of joy and cautious optimism. Emily and Margaret spent hours together, learning about each other's lives and slowly beginning to build the bond they had been denied for so long. But as the initial euphoria of their discovery began to settle, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't complete. There were still too many unanswered questions, questions that gnawed at her, even as she tried to focus on the present. One afternoon, as they sat in the cozy warmth of the penthouse library, Margaret decided it was time to confront the shadows of the past. She had been hesitant to bring it up, not wanting to burden Emily with the darkness that had surrounded her disappearance, but she knew they couldn't move forward without understanding what had truly happened all those years ago. "Emily," Margaret began carefully, setting aside the book she had been pretending to read, "there's something we need to talk about. Something that's been on my mind since we got the DNA results." Emily looked up from her own book, sensing the seriousness in Margaret's tone. "What is it?" she asked, her brow furrowing in concern. Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about how you ended up in that orphanage, how you were taken from me. I know it's painful, but I think we need to find out the truth about what happened. We need to know who took you and why." Emily's heart skipped a beat at Margaret's words. She had always wondered about her origins, about how she had ended up alone in the world, but she had never imagined she would have the chance to uncover the truth. Now that the opportunity was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready for what they might find. "You really think we can find out after all this time?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with both hope and fear. "I don't know," Margaret admitted, "but I believe we have to try, for both our sakes. I can hire private investigators, reach out to people who might have information, but I won't do it unless you're ready, Emily. This is your life too." Emily stared at her hands, her mind racing. The thought of digging into the past was terrifying, but the alternative, living with the uncertainty forever, was even worse. She had finally found her mother, but the specter of her abduction still loomed over them, casting a shadow on their newfound happiness. "I think we should do it," Emily said finally, her voice steady with resolve. "I want to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be." Margaret nodded, relieved by Emily's decision. "All right," she said softly. "We'll do it together. Whatever we find, we'll face it together." True to her word, Margaret wasted no time in contacting a renowned private investigator, a man named Thomas Reed, who had a reputation for uncovering even the most well-buried secrets. Within days, he was on the case, combing through old records, interviewing people connected to the orphanage, and following up on leads that had long since gone cold. As the investigation progressed, Margaret and Emily tried to go about their lives as normally as possible. But the tension was always there, lurking beneath the surface. They spent their days as they had before, sharing meals, exploring the city, and talking late into the night. But there was an unspoken understanding between them that something dark was waiting to be uncovered. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the phone rang, startling them both. Margaret quickly answered, her heart racing as she recognized the number on the caller ID. "Ms. Hastings, it's Thomas," the investigator said on the other end of the line, his voice calm but serious. "I've found something. I think you're going to want to hear this." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "What is it? What did you find?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's about the man who ran the orphanage where Emily was found," Thomas explained. "His name was Peter Lawrence. He was a well-respected figure in the community, known for his charitable work. But I've uncovered some disturbing information about him. It appears that he was involved in a black market adoption ring." Margaret's blood ran cold. "A black market adoption ring?" she repeated, the words barely registering in her mind. "Yes," Thomas confirmed grimly. "He would take in children, often from desperate or vulnerable families, and then sell them to the highest bidder. The records were falsified, and the parents were told their children had died or been given up for adoption through legitimate channels. It's likely that Emily was one of those children." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. "And my daughter, she was taken by him?" "It's possible," Thomas said. "But there's more. I've found records of a large payment made to Lawrence shortly after Emily was born. The payment came from a man named Richard Thornton." Margaret's heart sank at the mention of the name. Richard Thornton was a name she knew all too well. A former business associate of her late husband, a man with a reputation for ruthless ambition and questionable ethics. She had cut ties with him years ago, but she had never imagined he could be connected to something like this. "Thornton," Margaret whispered, her mind racing. "Why would he want to take my daughter?" "I don't have all the answers yet," Thomas said, "but I'm following up on it. There's a lot of secrecy surrounding Thornton, and it's going to take some time to unravel everything. But I thought you should know what I've found so far." Margaret nodded, even though Thomas couldn't see her. "Thank you, Thomas. Keep digging. I need to know everything." When Margaret hung up the phone, she turned to Emily, her face pale and her eyes filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "It's worse than I thought," she said, her voice trembling. "There's a man, Richard Thornton, who might have been involved in your abduction. He was connected to the man who ran the orphanage, and it looks like he paid to have you taken." Emily's eyes widened in shock. "Why would he do that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why would he want to take me?" Margaret shook her head, her mind still reeling from the revelation. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm going to find out. Whatever his reasons were, he's not going to get away with it." Emily felt a surge of anger rising within her. The idea that someone had stolen her away from her mother, from the life she was meant to have, filled her with a fury she had never known before. But beneath the anger was a deep, aching sadness. Sadness for the life she could have had, the memories she had been denied, and the years she had spent not knowing who she truly was. Margaret reached out and took Emily's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "We'll get to the bottom of this," she said, her voice filled with determination. "No matter what it takes, we'll find the truth." Emily nodded, grateful for her mother's strength. "I believe you," she said softly, "and I'll do whatever I can to help. I want to know who did this to us. I want to understand why." As they sat together in the dim light of the living room, the weight of the past pressed down on them. But they were no longer alone in their search for answers. Together, they would face the darkness that had stolen so much from them. And together, they would find the justice they both deserved. The journey ahead was uncertain, and the truth they sought could be more painful than they imagined. But for Margaret and Emily, the fight was just beginning. And no matter what the cost, they were determined to uncover the secrets that had been buried for so long. The discovery of Richard Thornton's involvement in Emily's abduction left Margaret and Emily reeling. The revelation was like a wound reopened, raw and painful, but it also ignited a fierce determination in both women. They were closer to the truth than ever before, but the path ahead was fraught with danger. Margaret knew that going up against someone as powerful and ruthless as Thornton would require careful planning and unwavering resolve. The next few days were a blur of activity. Margaret and Emily worked closely with Thomas Reed, who continued to dig into Thornton's past and connections, uncovering a web of deceit and corruption that spanned decades. As they delved deeper, it became clear that Thornton had not acted alone. There were others involved, people who had helped him cover his tracks and profit from the misery of countless families. Margaret's contacts in the business world proved invaluable. She reached out to old allies, calling in favors and gathering information that would have been impossible to obtain through official channels. The more they uncovered, the more they realized just how deep the conspiracy went. Thornton had used his wealth and influence to manipulate the system, ensuring that his crimes remained hidden. But as they got closer to the truth, the danger grew. Thornton was not a man to be trifled with, and he had resources at his disposal that could easily turn the tide against them. Margaret knew they had to be cautious, but she also knew that they couldn't back down. Not now, when they were so close to bringing him to justice. One evening, as they were reviewing the latest findings in Margaret's study, Thomas called with news that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Miss Hastings, I've just received some disturbing information," Thomas said, his voice tense. "It appears that Thornton has been monitoring your activities. He knows you're investigating him." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "How is that possible? We've been so careful," she said, her voice tinged with fear. "He has eyes everywhere," Thomas replied grimly. "I've been following his movements, and it seems he's been making inquiries about you and Emily. I believe he's planning something, but I don't know what yet." Margaret clenched her fists, anger rising within her. "What should we do? Should we stop the investigation?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "If we back down now, Thornton will win. But we need to be prepared. You and Emily should be on high alert. Thornton is a dangerous man, and if he feels threatened, there's no telling what he might do." Margaret's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts and fears colliding. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let Thornton intimidate her. He had already stolen 20 years from her, and she wasn't about to let him take anything more. "Thank you for the warning, Thomas," Margaret said, her voice steely with determination. "We'll be careful, and we'll keep going." After hanging up, Margaret turned to Emily, who had been listening with growing apprehension. "Emily, we need to be extra cautious from now on," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm. "Thornton knows we're onto him, and he might try to retaliate." Emily nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I understand," she said softly, "but I'm not afraid, Mom. We have to see this through." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride at Emily's courage. "We will," she promised. Together. Over the next few days, they took every precaution. Margaret increased security around the penthouse, hired additional bodyguards, and ensured that all their communications were secure. They knew they were walking a fine line, but they were determined to stay one step ahead of Thornton. Then, one night, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. Margaret and Emily had just finished dinner when the phone rang. It was Thomas again, but this time his voice was laced with urgency. "Miss Hastings, I found something. Thornton is planning to leave the country," Thomas said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't know all the details, but it looks like he's trying to flee before we can expose him." Margaret felt a cold chill run down her spine. "When? How much time do we have?" "Not much," Thomas replied. "He's booked a flight for tomorrow evening. If we're going to stop him, we need to act fast." Margaret's mind raced. They had come so far, uncovered so much, and now Thornton was about to slip through their fingers. She couldn't let that happen, not after everything they had been through. "We need to confront him," Margaret said decisively, "before he has a chance to escape. We need to make him face what he's done." "That's risky," Thomas warned. "If Thornton feels cornered, He could be dangerous. I don't care, Margaret said, her voice firm. This ends now. We confront him, we make him answer for what he's done, and we make sure he never hurts anyone else. Thomas hesitated, but he could hear the resolve in Margaret's voice. All right, he said finally. I'll help you, but we need to be smart about this. Thornton won't go down without a fight. They quickly devised a plan. Thomas would track Thornton's movements, while Margaret and Emily prepared to confront him at his office the following morning, before he had a chance to flee. They knew it was a dangerous gamble, but they had no other choice. That night, Margaret and Emily barely slept. The fear of what lay ahead gnawed at them, but so did the hope that this could finally bring them the closure they needed. Margaret spent the early hours of the morning going over the plan in her mind, steeling herself for the confrontation that was to come. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the city, they prepared to leave. Margaret dressed in her most powerful business attire, a silent message that she was not to be trifled with. Emily, though nervous, followed her mother's lead, determined to stand by her side no matter what. When they arrived at Thornton's office building, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Thomas was already there, waiting in a car parked discreetly across the street. He had been monitoring the building all night, ensuring that Thornton hadn't already slipped away. He's inside, Thomas confirmed as they approached. He's scheduled a meeting with some of his associates, probably to discuss his exit strategy. This might be our only chance. Margaret nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Let's do this, she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Together, they entered the building, passing through the opulent lobby with its marble floors and towering columns. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as they rode the elevator up to the top floor, where Thornton's office was located. She could feel Emily's hand trembling slightly in hers, but she squeezed it reassuringly, drawing strength from the bond they shared. When the elevator doors opened, they stepped out into a sleek, modern corridor. Thornton's office was at the end, guarded by a pair of imposing double doors. Margaret took a moment to compose herself, then strode forward with Emily by her side. They didn't bother knocking. Margaret pushed the doors open, her eyes immediately locking onto Thornton, who was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by paperwork. He looked up in surprise, his expression quickly hardening as he recognized them. Margaret Hastings, Thornton said, his voice cold and clipped. I must say, this is unexpected. What brings you to my office? Margaret didn't waste any time. We know everything, Thornton, she said, her voice sharp and unyielding. We know about the black market adoption ring, the payments, the lies. We know you're the one who had my daughter taken. Thornton's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dangerous passing across his face. I don't know what you're talking about, he said smoothly, though his voice was tinged with irritation. I think you've been misinformed. Don't lie to us, Emily spoke up, her voice trembling with anger. You stole me from my mother, from my life. You took everything from us. Thornton's gaze shifted to Emily, and for a moment, a flicker of recognition crossed his features. You, he began, but Margaret cut him off. We have the evidence, Thornton, Margaret said, her voice steely. We have enough to ruin you. You can't escape this. Thornton's face darkened, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and fear. You think you can just walk in here and threaten me? He snarled, rising from his chair. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I know exactly who you are, Margaret shot back. A man who profits from the suffering of others. But your time is up, Thornton. You won't hurt anyone else. For a tense moment, the room was silent, the air crackling with the unspoken threat between them. Thornton's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with fury. But then, something unexpected happened. Thornton let out a harsh, bitter laugh, shaking his head as if in disbelief. You're too late, Margaret, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. You think you can stop me? You think you can take me down? He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. You have no idea what I'm capable of, he hissed. And if you think I'm going to let you ruin me, you're sorely mistaken. Before Margaret or Emily could react, Thornton reached under his desk, pulling out a small, black object, a remote control. He pressed a button, and suddenly, alarms began blaring throughout the building. "Security!" Thornton shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Get these women out of my office." Within seconds, the doors burst open, and a group of armed security guards stormed in, their weapons drawn. Margaret and Emily were quickly surrounded, their escape routes cut off. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the gravity of the situation. They had walked right into Thornton's trap, but she wasn't ready to give up, not yet. "Emily, stay behind me," Margaret said urgently, positioning herself between her daughter and the guards. The guards hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Thornton barked another order, but before they could act, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the room. Thomas Reed burst through the large window, his gun drawn and aimed squarely at Thornton. "Nobody move!" he shouted, his voice commanding. The room froze, the tension reaching a boiling point. Thornton stared at Thomas, his expression a mix of shock and fury. "You're making a big mistake, Reed," he growled. "That's where you're wrong," Thomas retorted, his gaze unwavering. "You're the one who's made the mistake, Thornton. It's over." Margaret felt a surge of relief at Thomas's intervention, but she knew they weren't out of danger yet. "Emily, we need to go," she whispered urgently. But before they could make a move, Thornton lunged for the remote control again, his face twisted in a snarl. "You won't get away with this," he shouted, pressing another button. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, and Margaret realized with horror that Thornton had triggered the building's lockdown. They were trapped. As chaos erupted around them, Margaret clung to the one thought that had driven her this far. She would protect her daughter, no matter what, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. The room erupted into chaos as the alarms blared louder, echoing off the walls. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her. They were trapped, and Thornton was willing to do anything to escape. The armed guards shifted uneasily, caught between their orders and the unexpected presence of Thomas Reed, who stood resolute, his gun aimed at Thornton. "Lower your weapons," Thomas commanded, his voice cutting through the din. "I'm with the FBI, and if any of you fire, you'll be facing federal charges." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching out like an eternity. Thornton's eyes darted between Margaret, Emily, and Thomas, his mind racing to find a way out. "You're bluffing, Reed," Thornton spat, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You wouldn't dare shoot me. You don't have the authority." "Try me," Thomas replied coolly, his fingers steady on the trigger. "Your men won't save you. This building is surrounded by federal agents." "It's over, Thornton." The mention of federal agents seemed to have the desired effect. The guards, realizing they were outmatched, slowly began to lower their weapons. Thornton's bravado faltered as the reality of his situation set in. He was cornered, with no allies left to protect him. "Emily, get behind me," Margaret whispered, her voice urgent but calm. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she forced herself to stay focused. They had come too far to fail now. Emily obeyed, her eyes wide with fear and determination. She had never been in a situation like this before, facing down armed men, caught in the crossfire of a confrontation that could end in violence. But as she looked at Margaret, she felt a surge of strength. They were in this together, and they would see it through, no matter the cost. "Margaret," Thornton snarled, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You think you can take everything from me? I built this empire. I won't let you destroy it." "You destroyed yourself, Thornton," Margaret shot back, her voice firm. "You stole my daughter, ruined countless lives, and now you'll pay for it. It's over." Thornton's expression twisted into a sneer. "You think I'll just roll over and let you take me down? I'll fight you to the very end." "Don't make this harder on yourself," Thomas warned, his gun still trained on Thornton. "You're out of options. Surrender now, and maybe the court will show you some leniency." But Thornton wasn't listening. His eyes flicked toward the desk, where the remote control still lay within reach. Margaret saw the movement, her heart leaping into her throat as she realized what he was about to do. "Stop!" she shouted, but it was too late. Thornton lunged for the remote, his hand closing around it. He pressed the button again, and a series of metallic clicks reverberated through the room as the security doors slammed shut, sealing them inside. "Nobody leaves until I say so," Thornton hissed, his voice a low growl. "You think you can take me down? I'll make sure you all go down with me." Margaret's blood ran cold. The doors were reinforced, designed to withstand forced entry. They were trapped, and Thornton was willing to destroy everything to keep his secrets buried. But before Thornton could make another move, Thomas acted. With a swift, decisive motion, he closed the distance between them and delivered a powerful blow to Thornton's arm, sending the remote flying across the room. Thornton cried out in pain, clutching his arm as he staggered back. "Stay down, Thornton," Thomas ordered, his voice laced with authority. "This is over." But Thornton wasn't ready to surrender. Fueled by desperation, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pistol, aiming it directly at Margaret. Everything seemed to slow down in that moment. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she stared down the barrel of the gun. Time stood still as she locked eyes with Thornton, the man who had stolen her child and destroyed so many lives. She could see the madness in his eyes, the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. And then, just as Thornton's finger tightened on the trigger, Emily moved. With a cry of defiance, she lunged forward, throwing herself between Margaret and the gun. The sound of the shot echoed through the room, followed by a scream that pierced the air. Margaret's world tilted on its axis as she watched in horror. Emily crumpled to the floor, blood seeping from her side. "No!" Margaret screamed, dropping to her knees beside her daughter. "Emily, no. Stay with me." Thornton stood frozen, the gun still in his hand, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. For a brief moment, the madness drained from his eyes, replaced by a flicker of regret. But it was too late. Thomas acted quickly, disarming Thornton with a swift move and slamming him against the wall. The gun clattered to the floor as Thornton was subdued, but Margaret barely registered it. Her focus was entirely on Emily, who lay pale and motionless on the cold marble floor. "Emily, please," Margaret sobbed, cradling her daughter's head in her lap. "Don't leave me. I just found you. I can't lose you again." Emily's eyes fluttered open, filled with pain but also with a fierce determination. "I'm okay, Mom," she whispered, her voice weak. "I'm not going anywhere." Margaret's heart twisted with both relief and fear. "We need to get you to a hospital," she said urgently, pressing her hands against the wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. "You're going to be okay. I promise." The sound of sirens grew louder outside, and within moments, the room was flooded with federal agents, followed by paramedics who rushed to Emily's side. Margaret was gently pulled away as they worked to stabilize her daughter, but she refused to leave Emily's side. Thornton was dragged away in handcuffs, his face a mask of defeat. For all his bluster and threats, he was now a broken man, his empire crumbling around him. Margaret watched as he was led out, feeling a cold satisfaction in knowing that justice would finally be served. But her victory felt hollow as she turned her attention back to Emily. The paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher, and Margaret held her hand tightly as they wheeled her out to the waiting ambulance. "Mom," Emily murmured, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared." Margaret leaned down, pressing a kiss to Emily's forehead. "I'm right here, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You're going to be okay. I'm not leaving you." As the ambulance sped through the streets, Margaret prayed with all her heart that Emily would survive. They had been through so much, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing her daughter now, just when they had found each other. But even as she prayed, she couldn't shake the fear that the darkness they had fought so hard to overcome might still claim one final victory. The future was uncertain, and all Margaret could do was hold on to hope, and to the fragile thread that still connected her to the daughter she had fought so hard to protect. The ambulance lights flashed in the darkness as it raced through the city streets, sirens wailing a desperate cry. Margaret sat beside Emily, clutching her daughter's hand as the paramedics worked urgently to stabilize her. The interior of the ambulance was a blur of activity, voices calling out medical terms, the beeping of monitors, the smell of antiseptic. But all Margaret could focus on was Emily's pale face, her breaths shallow and labored. "Stay with me, Emily," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, stay with me." Emily's eyes fluttered open, and she managed a weak smile. "I'm trying, Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I won't leave you. I promise." Margaret's heart ached with both love and fear. She had already lost her daughter once. She couldn't bear to lose her again. As the ambulance pulled up to the hospital, Margaret prayed silently, her grip on Emily's hand tightening. The doors flew open, and the paramedics rushed Emily inside. Margaret followed, her heart pounding as they wheeled Emily into the emergency room. Everything moved so quickly. Doctors and nurses converged on Emily, shouting orders, attaching IVs, and preparing for surgery. A nurse gently guided Margaret to a waiting area, but Margaret refused to let go of Emily's hand. "Please," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Don't let her die. Don't take her away from me." "We're doing everything we can," the nurse said softly, her eyes filled with compassion. "But we need to take her into surgery now. She's in good hands." Margaret nodded, her hands trembling as she finally released Emily's hand. "I love you," she whispered as they wheeled Emily away. "I'll be right here when you wake up." And then, Emily was gone, the doors swinging shut behind her, leaving Margaret standing alone in the sterile, cold hallway. The silence was deafening, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt utterly powerless. She sank into a chair in the waiting room, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Every minute felt like an hour as she sat there, staring at the clock, willing it to move faster. She prayed, bargained with fate, did everything she could to keep the hope alive that Emily would survive. Hours passed, but Margaret refused to leave the waiting room. She barely noticed when Thomas Reed arrived, his expression grim but supportive. He sat beside her, offering silent comfort, but there was little anyone could say to ease the agony of waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor emerged from the operating room. Margaret shot to her feet, her heart in her throat as she searched the doctor's face for any sign of hope. "Miss Hastings?" the doctor asked, his voice calm but serious. "Yes, that's me," Margaret replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. "How's my daughter? Is she okay?" The doctor took a deep breath, his expression softening. "Emily is stable," he said, and Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. "The bullet caused significant damage, but we were able to stop the bleeding and repair the worst of it. She's in recovery now, and we'll keep her in the ICU for the next 24 hours to monitor her condition." Margaret's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Thank you," she breathed, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you so much." The doctor nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "She's a fighter, Miss Hastings. She's been through a lot, but she's strong. You can see her as soon as she's settled in recovery." Margaret nodded, barely able to speak through her tears. As the doctor walked away, she turned to Thomas, who was watching her with a mix of relief and concern. "She's going to be okay," Margaret whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. "She's really going to be okay." Thomas placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Margaret. You saved her." But Margaret shook her head. "No," she said softly. "Emily saved me. She's the reason I kept fighting, the reason I didn't give up. I've spent so many years searching for her, but now I realize that she was the one who found me." A few hours later, Margaret was allowed to see Emily. The ICU was quiet, the only sounds the soft beeping of monitors and the gentle hum of machines. Emily lay in the hospital bed, her face pale but peaceful, an oxygen mask covering her mouth and nose. Margaret's heart ached at the sight of her daughter in such a fragile state, but she also felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Emily was alive, and that was all that mattered. Margaret sat down beside the bed, taking Emily's hand in hers. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're safe now." Emily stirred at the sound of her mother's voice, her eyes fluttering open. It took a moment for her to focus, but when she did, a small smile spread across her lips. "Mom," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with love. "I'm right here," Margaret said. her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought I was going to lose you. I thought he was going to take you away from me." Margaret shook her head, her own tears spilling over. "No, Emily, nothing could ever take me away from you. We've been through so much, but we're here now. We found each other, and nothing will ever separate us again." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. But as they looked at each other, a sense of peace began to settle in. They had faced the darkness together and come out on the other side. They were stronger for it, and now they could begin to heal. "Thornton?" Emily asked, her voice tentative. "What happened to him?" Margaret's expression hardened for a moment, but then she shook her head. "He's gone, Emily. He won't hurt anyone ever again. The authorities have everything they need to bring him to justice. We don't have to worry about him anymore." Emily nodded, relief washing over her. She squeezed Margaret's hand, her grip weak but steady. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I just want to move forward. I just want to start over with you." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with love for her daughter. "We will, Emily," she promised. "We'll build a new life together. We'll take it one day at a time, and we'll make up for all the years we lost." In the days that followed, Emily's condition slowly improved. Margaret stayed by her side, helping her through the recovery process, and as the weeks passed, they began to rebuild their lives. The trauma of the past would always be with them, but they refused to let it define them. They were determined to move forward, to create new memories and cherish the time they had together. Margaret's life, once filled with loneliness and sorrow, was now overflowing with love and hope. She and Emily spent their days exploring the city, enjoying quiet evenings at home, and making plans for the future. They talked about everything, big dreams, small joys, and everything in between. It was as if they were making up for all the lost time, filling the years they had missed with laughter, tears, and unconditional love. One crisp autumn morning, as they walked through Central Park, the same place where their paths had first crossed, Emily paused, looking out at the vibrant colors of the trees. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't met that day?" she asked, her voice contemplative. Margaret smiled, pulling Emily close. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember that we did meet, and that's all that matters. We were meant to find each other, Emily. No matter how long it took, we were always going to end up here together." Emily nodded, a contented smile on her face. "I like to think that too," she said softly, "that we were always meant to be a family." As they continued their walk, the sun breaking through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the park, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. The darkness that had once overshadowed her life was finally lifting, replaced by a light she had never thought she would find again. She had her daughter back, and together, they had overcome the unimaginable. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led them to this moment, a moment of healing, of love, and of a future filled with endless possibilities. And as they walked through the park, hand in hand, Margaret knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They had found their way back to each other, and now they were ready to face the world. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly alive. The sun was shining, the world was full of promise, and she had everything she needed right by her side. It was a new dawn, a new beginning, and this time, nothing would ever come between them again.